Hi everyone, my name is Bahar. Happy to present transaction fee market design with parallel execution. First of all, I would like to thank the TLDR conference and organizers for including our work. So let me directly get started with how transactions are executed in Ethereum right now. So here we see a block of 4 transactions. What's happening in Ethereum right now is that the EVM is taking these 4 transactions in the order they were included and executes them one after the other sequentially. However, it's encountering scalability issues as the number of transactions continues to grow, and also they're getting more and more complex. That's why we're asking why Ethereum is not executing them in parallel in a deterministic way. This parallelizability is done by some blockchains already, such as Solana up to 3, and this is something Ethereum is yet to do. And we think that it would, since most consumer hardware is already with multiple cores, this would increase the throughput without increasing the hardware requirements. But to be able to have parallelizability, what else is there that we need to look at? Is there anything else potentially holding us back? Yes, well, that is that the fee market should be able to handle it, and this will be the focus of our work and of my presentation. But one thing I want to mention is that I've mentioned that there are some other blockchains that are already working with parallel execution. How do they handle it? Do they have an answer to this question? Well, many of them are yet to implement fee markets that are 100% designed for this. So although they have their versions of it, it is still under research. So we believe that this work is also relevant for them. So let's first look at the current fee market. To understand the problem here, we can say that the total fee is comprised of the gas unit and the price for each of these units. We can say that the gas unit is a measure of computational complexity, and also that currently the execution component of gas is a proxy for time, and we will assume here that it is basically the time to execute the transaction. And then we can also say that the total fee is made of the base fee that is being burned and also the priority fee that goes to the block builders or proposers. And in this presentation and in our work, we focus on the gas unit part. So in other words, we can say that our approach is as follows. A transaction enters a gas computation mechanism, and that gives us the units of gas that the transaction will use, and that again enters a transaction fee mechanism, which will deliver the amount of fee that is needed by this transaction. And we are focusing on the gas units, so the gas computation mechanism here, the GCM. So to kick this off, let me tell you about why this is not working super well right now. Well, let's look at a transaction, a simple one, transaction TX1, for example. Our transaction TX1 is using 6 units of time and also using 6 state variables. So these are being accessed and locked during the execution of this transaction. And we can think of them as maybe storage keys of a smart contract. So this will be everything that we need to know about this transaction. It does make some simplifications, but we believe that this is a good enough approximation of the real world. And then we can draw this transaction as a rectangle that you can see here. So on the y-axis, we see the unit of time that this transaction will take. And on the x-axis are the state variables that we're accessing and locking. In the presentation, for the sake of simplicity, I will always use consecutive state variables, whereas it's not obviously always the case. Now let me move forward to how this would work when computing the units of gas. So here we can see that this transaction TX1 is taking 6 time units That's why we say that is also using 6 units of gas. Whereas here, this transaction tx2, although locking less state variables, again using 6 units of gas, which would be perfectly fine in a sequential composition. But when we move to parallel execution, we would prefer that the transaction tx2 requires less gas, simply because it's not locking as many resources as tx1 is doing. So that being said, what properties would we want from the gas component in a fee market? That's, of course, parallel execution. In other words, what kind of transactions should consume less gas than others? And while introducing these properties, I will also be introducing you some of the mechanisms that we worked on in our work. And let me get started with a natural monotonicity property. This one is called time sensitivity, which says that if a transaction is using the same state variables, but taking no more time than the other one, then it should consume less gas. I think this is an intuitive one to see, because otherwise someone can just make their transactions longer and not pay for this extra effort. This is one of the properties that we would like to keep from the current fee market. So we're not just adding new properties, but also keeping some of the already existing ones. Then I would like to move forward to another natural monotonicity property called state variable sensitivity. Now, this one demands that if 2 transactions are taking same time units, then the one using a subset of state variables compared to the other one should consume less gas. Again, I would think this is quite intuitive, as a transaction using more state variables, locking more state variables, would not pay for this if it's not paying more in terms of gas units. So with that being said, I would like to propose one of the mechanisms that we worked on, which is weighted area GCM. What we do in this mechanism is look at the time units a transaction needs and multiply that by 1 plus the weight of each state variable that the transaction is locking. We assume here that these weights are set and they also reflect the demand in the block. If you would look at an example, assuming that the weights are set to 1 for the sake of simplicity, we would see here that the transaction tx1 this time would take 6 times 1 plus 6 gas units, whereas transaction tx2, locking obviously less state variables, would take 6 times 1 plus 2, which is clearly less than the gas units consumption by tx1 and is giving us the exact property that we wanted. Moving on to another example for this GCM, we would see here, again, assuming the weights are set to 1, this transaction tx1 would take the same amount of gas units as the transaction tx2, but looking at it as a block, we can see that transaction tx2 is clearly increasing the execution time more than tx1 does, because it cannot be parallelized with the blue transaction we see here. So we would also want to penalize that. And that's why I would like to talk about this other category of properties that we will want from the gas component. So we would want them to fairly reflect the execution time, the impact on the execution time. But before starting with these properties, I would like to introduce scheduling more precisely. So here we have a scheduling function, which, Vs of T, the capital T being the transaction set. Here our scheduler S with n threads is scheduling the transactions T, and this simply gives us the total time to execute them all under the schedule. An illustration schedule would be, for these 4 transactions, would look like this, for example, for a set of 4 transactions, assuming we have at least 3 threads. Whereas if you would have two threads, for example, then although the pink one does not share any state variables, with the red or the yellow transaction, it cannot be parallelized by them, with them. Okay, so now that we've seen how scheduling would work, I would like to propose another mechanism called the Shapley gas computation mechanism. This might not be quite intuitive unless we're super familiar with game theory, but what it's doing here is to look at every single order in which a transaction can join a transaction set and find how much it would increase the execution time of the full schedule and average that out. So looking at a more simple example, here we see that transaction TX1 can either join the transaction set before or after the blue one. And if it is added before, then it would increase the execution time by 2 time units, simply because otherwise it's an empty set. Whereas if it's added after the blue one, since it can easily be parallelized with the blue one, it would not increase the execution time, giving us an average of 1 gas unit. Whereas TX2 here would increase the execution time by 2 units if it's added before or after the blue one, simply because it cannot be parallelized. And that would give us 2 gas units, clearly greater than 1, and giving us the exact property that we wanted. So we're now looking at how long we would increase the execution time based on the other transactions in our block. Now I would like to introduce yet another property that we would run, maybe a bit more complex this time. It's transaction bundling. So here we assume that we have 2 transactions that you see on the right. So transaction TX1 and TX2, and the dark highlighted ones are the resource where we're accessing each of these state variables. A composition of them can be seen on the left. So we have a bigger transaction TX. And here, in this case, we would want the transaction TX to pay more than the total of what TX1 is paying and TX2 is paying. This could be, an intuition could be that TX is way harder to schedule simply because of its size. And besides that, if this was not the case, then some transactions can simply come together. They would have atomicity guarantees and they would not pay for this. Now that we've talked about it, I would like to introduce a new mechanism called time proportional makespan. This again looks at the time to execute the full transaction set. So we're looking at VT and we are taking the proportion of our specific transaction in the total of all transactions. And that would give us, in this example, that this transaction TX, for example, would have, the total execution time being 9, it would pay 6/9 of that 9. Whereas if we would have 2 different transactions, TX1 and TX2, as you can see here, the pink one can be scheduled in parallel with TX1 now, which was not the case when we were talking about the big transaction. Now each of these transactions will pay 3/9 times 6 instead of 9. And that would give us a sum that is smaller than that of the big transaction TX, giving us the exact property that we wanted. Moving on to another property is the scheduling sensitivity. This property this time has a prerequisite that says that if we have a transaction set T, which we can see as the blue transaction here, and if we add another transaction to that set, and if the execution time of the new total set is less than that of adding another transaction, for example, transaction TX2, then it should consume less gas. What would that mean in a simpler example, maybe? I will show once I introduce the equally split makespan. Is here we look at total execution time, divide that by the number of transactions we have in the set. And now looking at it, the same example, how that would work here is that we have the total execution time of 3 with 2 transactions here, whereas with this big transaction that holds a prerequisite, now is taking 8/2 gas units, which is exactly giving us the property, the scheduling sensitivity property that we wanted. With that being said, I would like to move to my very last property that I will be talking about in the presentation, which is easy gas estimation. This, I would say, is a practical one. And what it does is to look at whether the gas consumption of a transaction can be easily estimated without having to depend on the other transactions in the transaction set. So this is simply formalized by making sure the transaction is the gas consumption can be computed without being dependent on T. I would like to say here that this property can actually categorize our mechanisms into 2. So the ones with this property and without this property, as this property helps us compose the GCM with the transaction fee mechanism, whereas if we don't have this property, then it is not straightforward to compose. With that being said, I would like to talk about some of the results, or maybe just show you the results, as I didn't have time to talk about each of these properties and each of these mechanisms separately. Just wanted to give you a flavor of what it is that we worked on in our paper. And you can see the full list here. So based on these results, what do we believe is a good mechanism, or what do we think are some good candidates? So going back to the beginning of the presentation, this was what we were trying to achieve. So we were trying to find or propose some nice gas computation mechanisms. What we believe is a strong candidate is the TPM, so time proportional mechanism, looking at the total execution time of our block and then taking the proportionality of each transaction. This is, however, challenging to compose with the current transaction fee mechanisms, which would require some more work to get to that fee part. And that's why, although it's looking at how we would increase the execution time of the block, may not at this stage be the best candidate. That's why we propose yet another one, which is the weighted area. Since it has the easy gas estimation property, the estimation of the gas amount for transactions in this GCM does not depend on the other transactions in the block, and that's why it can be composed with current transaction fee mechanisms such as EIP 1559, which would give us both good properties and could work in a parallelized setting. So yeah, with that being said, I would like to thank you all for the attention, and you can see the full paper and archive with this QR code, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
So in the thing where you had the make span problem and you were looking at the amount of time, it looked like you were allowing transactions that touch the same resource to be executed in any order. But if you want a deterministic blockchain, shouldn't you specify a partial order on transactions so that if, like, let's say 2 transactions are touching the same AMM, transaction 1 has to go before transaction 2, because otherwise the state transition will be non-deterministic. So I'm wondering how you think about that.
So that's a very valid question. We didn't specifically looked at the priority ordering in a block. We did in our paper identify some more properties that we will want from the scheduler. But I would say the scheduler that we thought about doesn't have the exact set properties that is 100% ready. So I think that is something we can continue working on. Yeah.
Thanks for your talk. Obviously, there's a bunch of different ways of doing parallelism, instruction level, optimistic, et cetera, et cetera. To that point, how do you think about internalizing the costs of state access associated with the process of parallelism, as far as fees are concerned?
That's a good question. I think that is, again, something that might make sense, obviously, but as you said, there are many ways of both parallelizing and allocating costs to this parallelized transaction. So that's an idea. Yeah, to think about. Thank you.
In the industry today, amongst the different parallelized blockchains out there, is there an optimal design you think that's being used in practice, or something that's close to an optimal design that you've determined in the paper?
I think currently there is no one optimal design, although there are some ways of tackling this. For example, Solana has this local fee market where the different accounts have their different prices, for example. It is one way, which is also similar to what we mentioned as in rates, but nothing is 100% true and incentivizing users to submit parallelizable transactions. And also the options out there are not incentive compatible. So we believe that this is something that we can still work on, and something we wanted to show with our work, that there are some more steps that needs to be taken to get there.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I was wondering about the weights. Where do they come from? And is there have you thought of a mechanism of maybe updating them between different blocks in a similar way that EAP 1559 changes the gas price?
So this is something that I thought about while writing my thesis, but whatever. So we thought of some options. So the weights can either be dependent on the demand from the previous block. It can be some moving average of some of the previous blocks. It can be it can look at the current block and try to figure out how much each of the state variables are being logged. So there are many ways, and I don't think, or I don't know yet if there's one 100% true way of figuring out the ways. I think that is something we need to continue working on to find what will be the best option there. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's all the time we have questions right now. Please have a round of applause for the speaker.